Take this. It will help.
Hi, Tim.
Please, for the child.
When you think of Victorian England, what comes to mind? Probably images of elegance, refined manners, and strict moral codes. You might picture gentlemen in top hats and fine coats, ladies in elaborate long dresses, and a society built on strong, traditional values. It's an era we often romanticize, but lurking just beneath this polished surface was a reality so bizarre and disturbing. It sounds like something from a twisted novel. Imagine this. In public markets, right alongside livestock and produce, Victorian men were selling their wives. Yes, you heard that right. In front of cheering, jeering crowds, men would auction off their wives to the highest bidder. This wasn't some isolated freak occurrence. This was a widespread, albeit unofficial, custom known as wife selling. It was most common among the working class, particularly in rural areas. From the late 17th century all the way into the early 20th century, reaching its peak during the Victorian era. So, how on earth did this happen? Well, back then, divorce was an incredibly difficult and expensive process. It required a private act of parliament, a process so costly that only the wealthiest aristocrats could even dream of affording it. For the average person, getting a legal divorce was completely out of reach. They were, for all intents and purposes, trapped in unhappy marriages. Wife-selling emerged as a sort of folk divorce, a way for the poor to dissolve a marriage without the law's involvement. It was a public ritual, a spectacle. The husband would often lead his wife to a market or a public square, sometimes with a haltero rope or ribbon around her neck, arm, or waist. This wasn't meant to be as brutal as it sounds. The halter was symbolic. It was a gesture mimicking the sale of livestock, a grim nod to the fact that, under the law of the time, a wife was considered her husband's property. The husband would then make a speech, announcing his intention to sell his wife, often listing her virtues. Sometimes her faults to the crowd. Then, the bidding would begin. Onlookers, neighbors, and sometimes even the wife's secret lover would place bids. The atmosphere could be anything from festive and jovial, like a country fair, to tense and somber. Once the highest bid was accepted, the buyer would pay the husband, and the deal was done. The wife would leave with her new partner, and in the eyes of their community, the old marriage was over, and a new one had begun. The price could vary wildly. Some wives were sold for a few shillings, others for a pint of beer, and in rare cases, for a significant sum. Sometimes, the sale was even prearranged. A woman and her lover might have planned the whole thing with the husband, using the public auction as a way to legitimize their new relationship and avoid social stigma. Of course, the authorities and the upper classes looked down on this practice. They saw it as immoral, scandalous, and a stain on the nation's character. Newspapers of the time reported on these sales with a mix of shock and fascination, often describing them in lurid detail. Occasionally, officials would intervene and arrest those involved for public disorder. But for many working-class communities, it was simply a practical solution to an impossible problem. It was a desperate act of agency in a world that offered them very little. It gave people a way out of abusive or loveless marriages, a chance to start over. As the 19th century progressed and divorce laws slowly began to change, becoming more accessible to the common person, the custom of wife-selling gradually faded away. The last recorded case was in the early 20th century. Today, it stands as a shocking and surreal chapter in British history. It peels back the veneer of Victorian propriety to reveal a world that was far more complex, desperate, and frankly, stranger than we can imagine. It's a powerful reminder that history is never as simple as it seems in the textbooks. What do you think about this bizarre historical custom? Let me know your thoughts. Step into the past with me, back to Victorian England. When you picture this era, what comes to mind? Is it elegant ladies in corsets, gentlemen in top hats, the romantic novels of the Brontë sisters, or the inventive genius of Charles Dickens? Maybe it's the grandeur of Buckingham Palace or the chimes of Big Ben. It's an image of progress, of an empire at its peak, a society defined by its strict morals and unwavering sense of respectability. But that's only one side of the coin. Today, we're going to peel back that polished veneer and look at the darker, grittier reality that millions of Victorians actually lived. This isn't the story you find in fairy tales. This is the story of survival. The Victorian era was obsessed with one thing above all else. Respectability. How you appeared in public was everything. It dictated your social standing, your opportunities, and your worth in the eyes of society. You had to attend church, speak politely, and maintain a spotless household. This obsession created a world of stark contrasts, a society split in two. On one side, you had the burgeoning middle and upper classes, living in comfortable townhouses, enjoying new technologies like gaslighting and flushing toilets, and indulging in elaborate multi-course dinners. Their lives were a performance of piety and prosperity, but just beyond their manicured gardens and iron gates was another world entirely. For the vast majority of the population, life was a relentless struggle. The Industrial Revolution had pulled millions from the countryside into rapidly growing cities like London, Manchester, and Liverpool. They came seeking work, but what they found were sprawling, overcrowded slums. Families of 10 or more would be crammed into a single, damp, lightless room. There was no sanitation, no running water. Disease was rampant: cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis swept through these neighborhoods, claiming lives without mercy. The very air was thick with the black smoke from countless factories, a constant reminder of the relentless industry that powered the empire but choked its people. Let's talk about work. The Victorian work ethic was legendary, but for the poor, it was a death sentence. Men, women, and even very young children toiled for 12, 14, or even 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. In the textile mills, the air was filled with cotton dust that scarred the lungs. In the coal mines, children as young as 5 were sent down into the darkness to haul heavy carts of coal through narrow tunnels. Accidents were common, and there was no such thing as compensation. If you were injured, you were simply replaced. The wages were barely enough to keep starvation at bay. A typical family might spend nearly all of their income on just bread and rent, with nothing left for medicine, clothes, or any kind of comfort. This brutal reality was deliberately hidden from the public eye. The wealthy preferred not to see the poverty that their own fortunes were built upon. The prevailing belief, influenced by ideas of social Darwinism, was that poverty was a moral failing. The poor were seen as lazy, unintelligent, or drunkards who simply lacked the character to succeed. This attitude justified the lack of government support and the harsh conditions of the workhouses. If you couldn't support yourself, you could be sent to a workhouse where families were split up, and you were forced to do grueling labor in exchange for basic food and shelter. These places were designed to be so miserable that people would do anything to avoid them. So, while one part of society discussed literature and etiquette over tea, another part was fighting for its next meal. While the newspapers celebrated the empire's global reach and technological marvels, children were dying in factories to produce the goods that made it all possible. The clean streets and orderly parks of the wealthy districts were a carefully constructed facade, masking the chaos, hunger, and despair that defined life for millions. Victorian society valued order over fairness, appearances over empathy. It is a powerful lesson in how easily we can ignore the suffering that happens right under our noses. The ghosts of Victorian England remind us to always look beyond the surface. Thanks so much. Have you ever thought about what marriage was really like for women in the past? We see the romance in period dramas, but the reality was often far from a fairy tale. For centuries, when a woman said "I do," she wasn't just gaining a partner, she was legally giving up her identity. Imagine this. The moment you marry, everything you own, your land, your money, any inheritance instantly becomes your husband's property. This was the reality under a legal doctrine called coverture. A married woman was a femme covert, literally a covered woman, shielded by her husband's legal existence. She ceased to be a separate person in the eyes of the law. She couldn't sign contracts, sue someone, or be sued on her own. Her legal and economic life was completely absorbed by her husband's. And what about earning her own living? If a wife worked, any wages she earned legally belonged to her husband. He had the right to collect her pay directly from her employer. This wasn't just a social custom, it was the law. This economic dependency made it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for a woman to be independent or to save money for herself. She was entirely reliant on her husband's goodwill for every single penny. Even her own body wasn't truly her own. The law gave a husband significant control over his wife's physical person. The concept of marital rape was unlegally recognized, because a wife was considered to have given irrevocable consent to her husband upon marrying him, and if a wife tried to leave an unhappy or abusive marriage, her husband had the legal right to physically force her to return home. He could essentially capture her, and the law would be on his side. Divorce. For a very long time, it was almost unheard of, and when it was possible, it was incredibly difficult and expensive to obtain. It often required a special act of Parliament or Congress. The grounds for divorce were heavily stacked against women. A husband could often divorce his wife for a single act of adultery, but a wife usually had to prove much more like adultery, combined with cruelty or desertion. And even if she succeeded, she might lose her children and be left with nothing. This system effectively trapped women in marriages, whether they were happy or not. For many, marriage was a permanent state with no escape. It wasn't a partnership of equals. It was a relationship of owner and property. While some husbands were kind and loving, the law gave all husbands immense power, creating a structure where abuse and control could flourish without legal consequence. The fight for women's rights was, in large part, a fight against this very system. Activists like the suffragettes and legal reformers spent decades chipping away at these laws. The Married Women's Property Acts, passed in the UK and the US in the late 19th century, were a monumental step forward. For the first time, these laws allowed married women to own property in their own name, control their own earnings, and enter into contracts. It's a powerful reminder of how far we've come. The rights we often take for granted today: the right to own what we earn, to control our own bodies, and to leave a marriage that isn't working were won through long and difficult struggles. Understanding this history isn't about blaming the past. It is about appreciating the present and recognizing the importance of continuing to strive for. Imagine living in a marriage you're desperate to escape, but the law, society, and your own wallet all say, no way. Welcome to Victorian England, a time when saying I do was truly a life sentence for most people. We often think of the Victorian era through the lens of romantic novels, but the reality of marriage and divorce was far from a fairy tale. For the vast majority, divorce wasn't just difficult, it was practically impossible. Let's break down just how monumental a task it was. Before 1857, getting a divorce was a Herculean feat. It wasn't something you could just file for at your local courthouse. Oh no. It was a multi-stage, soul-crushingly expensive process that was only available to the absolute wealthiest and most powerful men in the country. Forget about equality. A woman trying to divorce her husband faced even higher, almost insurmountable, hurdles. So, what did you have to do? First, you had to go to the ecclesiastical courts, the church courts, to get a legal separation. This was called a divorce, a mensa, et thoro, which means from bed and board. This didn't actually dissolve the marriage. You were still legally married, unable to remarry, but you were allowed to live apart. To get this, a man had to prove his wife's adultery. A woman, however, had to prove not just adultery, but adultery combined with other serious offenses like incest, bigamy, or life-threatening crudity. The double standard was baked right into the system. But that was just step one. After securing your legal separation, you then had to sue your wife's lover in a civil court for a criminal conversation. This was basically a lawsuit for damages, treating the wife's infidelity as a form of property damage against the husband. If you won this case, you might be awarded a hefty sum of money from the man who had an affair with your wife. This step was humiliating, public, and again, incredibly expensive, with lawyers' fees piling up. If you managed to clear both of these legal hurdles, you reached the final boss. Parliament. You had to petition for a private act of Parliament to officially dissolve your marriage. This involved presenting your case, all the evidence, and the rulings from the previous 2 court cases, to the House of Lords. They would debate your personal life, and if they approved it, the bill would then go to the House of Commons. Only after it passed both houses and received royal assent would you finally be divorced and free to remarry. As you can imagine, this entire process could take years and cost a fortune, tens of thousands of pounds in today's money. Between 1670 and 1857, only 325 divorces were granted by Parliament, and almost all of them were initiated by men. For the average person, the working class, the shopkeepers, the farmers, this was as attainable as buying the moon. They simply did not have the money, the time, or the political connections. So what did people do? They were trapped. Some simply ran away, abandoning their families to start a new life elsewhere under a new name. Risky move that could lead to charges of bigamy. Others endured miserable, and sometimes violent, marriages for their entire lives. The most common, though unofficial, solution for the working class was something called wife selling. It sounds shocking, and it was, but it was seen by some as a public, consensual way to end a marriage. A husband would take his wife to a public market, lead her with a halter around her neck or arm, and sell her to the highest bidder, who was often her new partner. This was, of course, illegal, but it was sometimes tolerated as a pragmatic, albeit deeply grim, solution in a society that offered no other way out. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 finally moved divorce from Parliament to a new civil court, making it slightly more accessible, but it was still expensive, and the double standard for proving adultery remained. It wasn't until well into the 20th century that divorce became a realistic option for ordinary people. So, the next time you hear a story about Victorian romance, remember the hidden reality. For most, marriage was about— Imagine stepping back in time, not to a world of kings and castles, but to the dawn of the modern age, the Industrial Revolution. For millions, this wasn't a time of glorious invention, but of grinding reality. Let's pull back the curtain on the lives of the industrial workers who built our world. The day started before the sun was up and ended long after it set. 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours of relentless work in a factory or a mine. The pay, barely enough to survive. We're talking pennies for a day's labor that left bodies aching and spirits crushed. This wasn't a job you could just quit. For most, it was this or starvation. After that grueling shift, where did they go? Home wasn't a sanctuary. Picture an entire family, mother, father, and several children cramped into a single, often windowless room. This one room was the kitchen, the bedroom, the living area, everything. Privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford. Disease spread like wildfire in these crowded, unsanitary conditions. Clean water was scarce, and the air was thick with smoke and soot from the nearby factories. Hunger was a constant, unwelcome guest. Meals were meager, often just bread and potatoes, day in and day out. Malnutrition was rampant, stunting children's growth and leaving everyone vulnerable to illness. A bad harvest or a slight dip in wages could mean the difference between a sparse meal and no meal at all. The gnawing emptiness in their stomachs was a daily reminder of their precarious existence. Now, imagine the strain this put on relationships. When a marriage began to crumble under the immense pressure, there was no escape. Divorce was practically impossible for the working class, both financially and legally. So, a couple that could no longer stand each other was still forced to share that single, tiny room. The same bed, the same cramped space, day after day. You can feel the tension, the resentment, the silent bitterness filling the air. This trapped feeling, this constant stress, often boiled over into violence. Frustrations from the factory, the hunger, the hopelessness, it all needed an outlet. And tragically, that outlet was often found at home. Domestic disputes became common, turning the one place that should have been a refuge into another battlefield. To numb the pain, many turned to alcohol. Pubs offered a cheap, temporary escape from the grim reality. But this so-called remedy only fueled the fire. Drunkenness worsened conflicts, drained what little money a family had, and deepened the cycle of violence and despair. It was a vicious loop. The misery led to drinking, and the drinking led to more misery. For the men, there was an overwhelming sense of being trapped. They were expected to be providers, yet their exhausting labor barely kept their families from the brink. They felt powerless, stripped of their dignity by foremen and factory owners, unable to change their circumstances. Their dreams, if they ever had them, were suffocated by coal dust and factory smoke. And the women, their helplessness was a different, but equally profound, kind. They managed the home, stretched every penny, cared for sick children, and often worked themselves, either in the factories or taking in laundry or sewing. They endured the brunt of the domestic turmoil, trying to hold their families together against impossible odds, watching their children go hungry and their husbands fall into despair. This wasn't just a difficult life. For many, it was a life without hope. This is the often untold story of the human cost of industrial progress. It's a somber but vital piece of our history, reminding us of the struggles that paved the way for the rights and standards we have today. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Have you ever heard of wife selling? It sounds like something straight out of a dark fantasy novel, but believe it or not, it was a very real, albeit unofficial, custom in England from the late 17th century all the way up to the early 20th century. Now, before you jump to conclusions, let's be clear. This was never a legally recognized practice. It was a folk custom, a way for poor working-class people to end an unhappy marriage when a legal divorce was completely out of reach. For them, a proper divorce through the courts was unbelievably expensive and complicated, reserved only for the very wealthy. So, how did this strange custom work? Well, it was a surprisingly public affair. A husband would lead his wife, often with a halter made of ribbon around her neck, arm, or waist, to a public place. This wasn't meant to be degrading like it sounds. The halter was symbolic, mimicking the way livestock were led to market. This public spectacle was crucial. It served as a community announcement, ensuring everyone knew the marriage was over and the wife was now free to remarry without accusations of bigamy. The locations for these sales were very specific and deliberately chosen. Public markets were a popular spot. Imagine the scene. Among the stalls selling vegetables, meat, and crafts, a man would stand on a block or a cart, auctioning off his wife. It sounds bizarre to us, but for them, the market was the center of community life, the place where all public business was conducted. By holding the sale there, it was witnessed by dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people, giving the transaction a sense of communal legitimacy. Another common venue was right outside a pub or an inn. This makes sense when you think about it. Pubs were social hubs where people gathered, deals were made, and news was shared. A crowd was guaranteed, often the husband, the wife, and the new buyer, who was usually the wife's prearranged new partner, would seal the deal with a drink inside the pub afterward. The transaction was often a token amount, sometimes just the price of a pint, to make the exchange feel formal and final. Livestock fairs were also a prime location. This is where the symbolism of the halter becomes really clear. By selling a wife at the same place where cattle and sheep were sold, it was a very blunt, practical way of transferring property. Again, this sounds harsh to our modern ears, but it was a ritual understood by the community. The wife's consent was usually a key part of the process. In many recorded cases, she was a willing participant, happy to be moving on with a new partner. The sale was just the public ritual to formalize it. So why did the location matter so much? It was all about public witness. Without official legal documents, the community's collective memory was the only record. Holding the event in a crowded market, a busy pub, or a bustling fair ensured that everyone knew the first marriage was dissolved. This protected the woman and her new husband from legal trouble and social stigma. It was a practical solution to an impossible problem. A fascinating glimpse into a time when ordinary people had to create their own rules to navigate life's challenges. It really shows how customs in society adapt when the official systems fail the people they were supposed to serve. Thanks for watching. If you found this piece of history as fascinating as I did, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the weird and wonderful parts of our past. See you in the next one.